Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In this video we're going to be discussing the IEB English Home Language Paper 1 and some of my tips on how to approach this paper. So firstly, we need to understand what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a 3-hour paper that's worth 100 marks. So essentially, every mark equals 1%. So it really makes a difference how you approach this paper in terms of the timing of it, in terms of how you answer the questions. So what's quite nice about this paper is that you know that you're going to have 6 questions and you know that each of them are for a certain amount of marks. So beforehand, you can actually split up your time and you can go into that exam and ensure that you complete the work within the 3 hours. I know 3 hours seems like a long time, but there's quite a lot to do in 3 hours. And so this would be sort of my advised timeline in terms of how to give each section the necessary attention that it needs, but also not to spend too much time in it so that you are able to answer all of the questions, because that's really important. I'm noticing now that I left out an N in comprehension there, so my apologies. Bit ironic for an English video to have a spelling mistake. So question 1, comprehension, I would give that the most amount of time, about 45 minutes. It is the section that most people do struggle with. It does require you to read that text multiple times. Summary, around 20 minutes. Scene poetry, 25 minutes. Unseen poetry, 30 minutes. Your scene poetry should take shorter than unseen poetry because this is the section where you really should know your theory. You should have studied your scene poetry well, so when you get those questions, they shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Whereas unseen poetry, you need to, delve into the poem and allocate more time to understanding it. Visual literacy, 40 minutes. Visual literacy and comprehension, same amount of marks, very similar techniques. However, I do find people struggle less with visual literacy. Something about it not being a whole bunch of writing makes it slightly easier. And then textual editing, 10 minutes. And then as you can see, checking time, I've put there 10 minutes. Theoretically, I would say you just need around 5. So you can just add that 5 minutes to whatever you need to. During checking time, you need to be checking that you've answered every single question. My advice would be, if you don't understand a question, to write something and then put a star by it so you come back to it. And so during your checking time, you need to go back to it, add a sentence here, add a sentence there, ensure that everything's clear and you've answered every single question. So now let's talk about each of these sections in a bit more detail. So your comprehension is 25 marks. So now for comprehension, here are a few techniques that I would suggest. There are obviously way more and I could talk for hours about this, but I'm going to try and keep it short and succinct. So understand the main message or the fundamental theme of the comprehension. Often students get lost in the details. So understand what the main message is about and let that guide what your answers are going to be. Because remember, that's going to be the intention of the writer, and everything else the writer is going to include is in an effort to communicate this fundamental message. Answering techniques are really important. Understanding how to answer your questions is significant, and your answering techniques are linked to your mark allocations. So if it is a 2-mark question, only write 2 sentences, because there you're going to have 2 points in 2 separate sentences. So you're going to get your 2 marks, but also you're going to avoid wasting time. 3 marks, 3 to 4 sentences. 4 marks, 4 to 5 sentences. Make sure that you think about what the marker is testing, and with comprehension, what they're testing is, have you comprehended the information? So you need to make it very clear in your answer that you have comprehended. So if they ask you about the juxtaposition in paragraph 1, you need to ensure that you communicate that you understand what juxtaposition is and that you've read paragraph 1. Theory versus content and practical application. So you need to unpack what each question is asking. Is it a pure content question when they're just asking you to explain the meaning of something? Or is it a theoretical question where they're asking you about, with some sort of terminology like diction or juxtaposition or tone? And often it's a combination of the two. So they'll ask you to assess how the diction enforces the tone, but you have to remember to showcase that you understand the theory, so by quoting the diction and saying what the connotations are, by telling me the tone using an adjective, but then you also have to explain it with relation to that text. So maybe it's about, the diction of destruction has very negative, violent connotations, and this shows how dangerous the climate situation is. So you need to be linking your theory and your content in most of your answers, and understanding what the marker is expecting is crucial. Intertextual questions. So with IEB, they love asking intertextual questions. Not only that last question where they usually link it to some sort of cartoon, but also they give you like a definition and they ask you to assess whether this definition matches what the writer says in paragraph whatever. So understanding with intertextual questions that sometimes there is an argument, sometimes you need to actually assess which one is better, sometimes you're just arguing whether they support each other, sometimes you're just discussing them. But typically you need to refer to both of the texts in your answer. So make sure with intertextual questions that you are very certain that you have given the marker everything that they're looking for, that you have assessed each of those different, text, the definition, and the paragraph 3. Sometimes they even refer to 3 things. They want the title, they want the paragraph 3, and they want the definition that they've given you in the question. So making sure that you've attacked each aspect and that ultimately you've provided a logical reason at the end as to why you've incorporated all those different things and which one supports the other or which one is better than the other. Remember to quote and explain. So this is something that the IEB that makes it different to DBE. So in DBE they do sometimes expect quotes. IEB, it's an absolute requirement, especially if you're getting a 3-mark, 4-mark question. You have to quote from the text, but you cannot just quote. You need to quote and explain yourself. Remember, comprehension, I'm checking, has the student understood, have they comprehended the information? And so if you're just going to quote, then I don't have that evidence that you've actually understood it. So give a short quote around 3 to 5 words, explain that quote. I have made a video about comprehension skills. I did use the DBE questions as a guide, but please have a look at those, and just remember the difference between like DBE and IEB comprehensions is typically your mark allocations and your level of questions, but that video gives a really thorough analysis on how to answer questions, so please check that out if you're struggling with comprehension. Your summary is 10 marks. This might be controversial, but something that my English teacher taught me and that I would advise to you is to leave the summary until the end of the paper. This is the one section in paper 1 where it's pretty challenging to figure out where your marks are coming from. It's marked according to a rubric and it's, in my opinion, actually quite subjective. So I would definitely leave the summary to the end. I don't think it's worth, when you're at the beginning of an exam, you have the most brain power and you're not fatigued by the exam. So I would leave this till the last. It's not an important section. I mean, it's 10%, it's very important, and you can obviously work on your skills to do better in summary, but it's the one that I would definitely leave to the end. Tips for summary include reading the question very carefully. Understand what the purpose of this text is. Make sure you understand what the register is, what the tone is. Are you writing for a brochure? Are you on a radio show? Are you doing a speech to teenagers, or are you doing a speech to parents? That audience, understanding your audience and understanding the purpose of a summary is going to be crucial to how you position the information. Only include relevant information. Count your points. Oh my god, another typo there, my apologies. But go to your actual insert and don't be afraid to write on your paper. That's something as well for paper 1, is I don't know why people don't write on their papers. So you take your insert, highlight the points, count your points, try and get to at least 5 points. I know you only have 90 words, it's very limited. Try to get to 5 to 6 points, because then your content marks are going to be there and you're going to have actually answered the question. Write in your own words, not using your own ideas. So that's a big thing with paper 1, is a lot of it you need to say things in your own words, but you cannot use your own ideas. The same with comprehension, unless they specifically ask for your opinion, which is usually only like 1 question in the paper. You need to be interpreting what the writer's saying and just communicating that in your own way. Also, shift your sentences around. So play with active and passive, play with paraphrasing, play with synonyms, but really, and you can also remember, you don't have to use the exact order that they've given you in the summary. In the text, in your summary, you can do the last point first. Also remember, you need to, for an intertextual summary, because they usually give you 2 or 3 texts, make sure that you have made clear reference to each of those texts, because that is marks that you are going to lose if you've only referenced 1 text. Word count. Okay, word count is so important. Read the instructions. This is something where you really should not be taking any risks. Firstly, including the word count is important. If you don't include a word count, they might take a mark off, which, as we discussed earlier, is 1%. So make sure you provide a word count. The word limit is 90. If you go over 90, you will get penalized. So make sure you are about 87 to 90 words there, and don't ever write 91 words or 92 words, because you might get that marked down. If it's 91 words, then maybe you can lie a little bit and say 90, but otherwise really don't lie. Stick to 87 to 90 words. The next section is scene poetry, which is 15 marks. So with scene poetry, this is a section where you actually have a lot of control. So study your figures of speech, study the message, the tone, the theme of each poem. I know it's 19 poems. I know it's really hectic. Hopefully you have been studying them since maybe grade 11, so you're a bit more familiar with them. But make sure that you go through each of those and highlight those key figures of speech. Write down what the message of each one is, the tone of each one, and the theme of each poem is. Those are your main things that come up in questions that you're going to have to answer. So even if you're getting overwhelmed by all your notes, go make copies of all the different poems and just write these key things down. If you can teach the poem, you've understood the content. So if you can print out a blank poem and you can teach it to your friend or teach it to the wall, you've understood that poem. Because in teaching something, you need to have the vocabulary to explain yourself, to explain what the poem's all about. And that's something crucial that you need to make sure that you're prepared for, because often students understand the poem, but then they don't have the vocabulary to communicate and articulate what they're trying to say. So try and teach the poem to someone, because then you'll have the vocabulary with which to express yourself. And that's also why I advise going through and checking and writing down what the message, what the tone is, while you have access to Google, while you have access to videos and such, to study those words so you have the words to express yourself in the exam. Answering techniques. These are the same as your comprehension answering techniques. Make sure you watch that video on the answering techniques for comprehension, and also I have done a video on scene poetry. So make sure you watch that. It's a really short video, but how to assess the mark allocation, how to answer each part of the question, defining each part of the question. Quoting is very significant here. So you need to quote from the text. It's right in front of you, but you also need to explain. So when they ask you for the figure of speech, define the figure of speech, say it's a simile, quote it, say what's being compared to what, and say its effectiveness. Remember, effectiveness is usually linked to emphasis. So if they ask you to describe the effectiveness or assess the effectiveness, it's usually to emphasize the message of, and then be specific about what that message is. Take note of how your teacher came up with the interpretation of each line of the poem. So this is also significant for unseen poetry. Because there's 19 poems, it's a lot to remember, and you can't expect yourself to remember every single detail. But if you can understand the skill of how to assess a poem and how to answer a question on a poem, then you are going to be at a significant advantage. So see how the teacher has seen, okay, this is the fundamental message. This line is going to link to that message in this way. This comparison is going to emphasize this and this. And there are videos online of all these different scene poems. So go watch those, see how the teacher interprets each word, each, piece of like form or structure or rhyme scheme, and understand how that links to the fundamental message. So a lot of similar things to comprehension in terms of answering techniques and in terms of analysis, but poetry in itself, this is an easy section, I would say. I think this is the easiest section, the one where you can really excel, because firstly it's content based, so it's easy to remember the sort of story of each poem, but preparation is key here. Unseen poetry, a further 15 marks. Okay, so unseen poetry, I have made a video, and there's another typo in this, so my apologies, but I've made another video on unseen poetry, actually the first video on this channel, so please make sure that you go and watch that. It's really short, but it has some really good tips as to how to approach it. My first big tip is read all the questions before attempting to answer. So I don't typically say this for every section. I think sometimes it can get overwhelming if you read through all the questions, because then you're thinking about question 11 before you're doing question 2. But for unseen poetry, you need to read all the questions before attempting to answer, because they give you hints, they give you clues. It will say like, explain the effect of, or they might say, how is the melancholic tone portrayed? So you immediately know it's a melancholic tone, and you can apply that to try and understand the meaning of the poem. Remember, you don't have to understand the entire poem. I think people get very frustrated with unseen poetry because it seems like very difficult to understand the whole thing under pressure. I mean, who are you? You're not an English teacher. You're not supposed to be teaching poetry. So just take a deep breath. Remember, you don't have to understand everything. You just have to understand the key things. And looking at the question is going to give you those hints. Also, because it's IEB, they link it to a scene poem. So read the scene poem it connects with to understand the main theme or message which they share. And that intertextual question is going to give you a lot of hints. So there might be a shared strand of nature or of catharsis or whatever it might be. And so you know the scene poem, so read the scene poem and see how it connects to the unseen poem. And then you can figure out the meaning of the unseen poem, a lot easier and more easily. Answering techniques, same as in poetry. Know how to answer your questions. Study your poetry terminology. So this is important. Understand all your different figures of speech. Understand form and structure. Understand tone and message. Things like enjambment or alliteration, sound devices. Make sure you study all that terminology. And that's a big misconception with English, is that you don't have to study. There are so many different things you can study for this. Visual literacy, 25 marks. This is another big chunk of the paper. So my big advice here is the same sort of answering techniques as comprehension, but here you need to study your techniques of humor. So you need to study irony, pun, sarcasm, satire, know those definitions and be able to integrate those into your answers so that you are demonstrating to the marker that you've studied, that you've understood it. Understand the common thread and the key intention of the message, and look at the text in comparison with one another. So a lot of the time the texts you're given, they all relate in some way. So they're all about, there's a past paper on vaccinations, another past paper on like veganism. So usually all the different texts relate to each other, and sometimes there'll be comparative questions, or sometimes it will be differing views. So you might have an advert advocating to eat meat, and then you might have a campaign advocating for you to become vegan. So understand all those different texts, and this is something you can do in reading time if you'd like, just reading through all the texts and understanding what each intention is, because that's what ultimately you're assessing here. You're understanding how the techniques of humor communicate the key intention. So whether it's an advert or it's a campaign, they're trying to convince you of something. If it's a cartoon, they're trying to inform you of some sort of critical issue in society in an entertaining way. So make sure you understand the key intention, the key message, the underlying common thread, and how they compare with each other. Answering techniques, once again, watch the comprehension video to assist you in this regard. With visual literacy, it's different to comprehension is your visual and your verbal clues. So verbal clues are like comprehension, like diction and pronouns, and you're looking at the words itself. But visual, you can't quote visual. You can't, quote what's happening in the facial expression or the body language or the font or the color. But what you can do is you can be extremely specific. So instead of saying, we can see that the boy is upset because of his facial expression, rather say we can see that the boy is upset because he has tears coming down his face as his facial expression. So making sure you are specific with those visual clues and you explaining yourself is key. Textual editing, 10 marks. This section is all about studying and your well-rounded knowledge of, being an English student. So study the terminology, study the theory. Don't leave anything out in this section. This is a section which is obviously the last section, and so people sometimes run out of time, and this is really detrimental because a lot of these questions are just 1 mark, 2 mark questions that you can easily find the error and just write it down. So really, if you're running out of time, skip to this section and try to answer those questions, but hopefully you're not going to run out of time because I've given you all those different timings to work on. Look out for the main suspect. So, if you look at past papers, they do give they ask a range of different things in textual editing, and it's very difficult to predict what they're going to ask because they ask random things each year. But look for your usual suspects, like concord errors, apostrophe errors, function of the hyphen. So when they ask you for a grammatical error, a punctuation error, look out for those and read the questions very carefully, because it's very different if they say name the error, because that means they want you to say concord error, or if they say identify and correct the error, because there they mean you must quote has and say has should be have. So make sure you read your questions carefully, and this one is a key studying one. So you need to study all your punctuation marks, all the different errors, things like that, so that you are prepared. Some general tips. Past papers are really important for this section. You can access them all online. This is a skills-based paper, and so past papers are really going to hone your skills. Remember that the memo for English is not really a memo, it's more of a marking guideline. So make sure that you don't stick to it. You don't have to stick to it 100%, because we do give marks for how you interpret or how you justify or motivate your response. But have a look at the descriptors that are on the memo for November 2021's paper, and you'll see how the questions are marked in a sort of global fashion. But doing those past papers and practicing writing those 3 markers, practicing under time conditions so that you don't run out of time in the exam is important. And with these new timings I've given you, I would suggest that you definitely try a paper using these timings to see how they work out for you, whether they work or they don't work, because obviously this is just my advice, this is my opinion, this is how I approached writing my matric exam and how I've been teaching my students how to approach a paper 1. But some things work for some students, some things don't. So you've got to figure that out, and the way you figure that out is by doing past papers and testing yourself. Also, going back to that textual editing, how they can ask you anything. If you do past papers, and even for the textual editing, if you don't get to past papers, just go and have a look at the previous papers with the memos for textual editing, and just see what these sort of questions that they ask and what the answers are, so that you are aware of that and you've covered all your bases. Some years they ask initialisms and acronyms, and then they won't ask it for 3 years. So go back around 5 years, go to the supplementary papers, and just look at the sorts of questions that they ask, even for comprehensions. So for instance, I've been working with some of my students on recent past papers, and we've seen the word anecdotes come up quite a few times in the comprehension. And so if you don't know what anecdotes is, you need to go and search that, because it might come up again. The next thing, I mentioned this earlier, is studying. Study the theory. As much as English is your home language, it's your first language, you can speak English very well, there is a lot of theory in this exam, and you need to study that theory. So study all your different terms, make sure that you understand the foundational skills of English and how to answer the questions. There is definitely studying to be done. Your mindset in the examination. As I mentioned before, this is a skills-based paper. So a lot of these texts, if you think about it, you're seeing them for the first time. The only texts that you've already seen are your scene poetry. So you have to be in a certain mind space, in a certain mindset and headspace in the exam, because you have to think critically under time pressure. So all those cliche things that you get told about being prepared for an exam, like having a good night's rest, eating breakfast, going to the bathroom before you start the exam, all those things are extra important in English Paper 1, because you are dealing with texts that you've never seen before. You need to be calm, you need to be collected, you need to take your deep breaths, and you need to trust in your ability to understand the text. It's absolutely critical that you're in the right headspace for this exam. And I'm actually, I'm happy for this year, which is 2022, that you guys have already written a few exams. So English is not your first exam, because sometimes I think it happens that way. So at least it's not your first exam. You're used to how things are done during final exams. So you should be more at ease with it when they're handing out the papers. Just clear your mind and try and get into the zone for those 3 hours where you're going to be focusing on trying to analyze and unpack these texts. Next thing is focus on the intentions of each text and each question. So with regard to the texts, remember that the writer or the cartoonist is always trying to position us to believe something, even the advertiser, obviously. So focus on what the intention of the text is. And remember, intention is always a verb, so it's to inform or to educate or to satirize, to criticize, to entertain. Try and figure out what each text is doing. So it's to satirize load shedding, or it's to inform us about climate change. Try and understand the intention and the main message of each text, and that's going to guide how you respond to it and all the different components of that. Similarly, focus on the intentions of each question. So like we spoke about with comprehension, going through, is this a theory question, or is this a practical question, or is this a combination? Or what are they testing in this question? And if you understand the intention of the question, then you can provide the answer that they're looking for. Lastly, try every question. You never know. This is so important, because when people leave things out, you give the marker no choice but to give you 0. If you try something, even if it's something that you think is bizarre in your head or you haven't really understood it, but you give something a go, who knows, you might actually get half a mark just for, interpreting something. Also note that these exams are moderated. They have to stick to a certain average for each year, and so they go back and they recheck things. They may be more lenient than you think with certain questions which they find people are not getting right. So always give something, always write something. And alternatively, there are some people, I know that this is something I struggled with. I thought this was such a crazy idea that I had, that I'd obviously interpreted the text wrong. But I just wrote my answer and it actually turned out to be correct because I justified it. So just write down everything. And with English, what's so wonderful about it is you can really come up with anything. It doesn't even have to be in the memo. But as long as you justify and motivate your response using evidence, then you can do very well. So please try every single question. Good luck for the exam. Remember to keep a positive attitude, and I'm sure that you're going to excel in these final exams. So good luck. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.